This photograph sat frozen on undeveloped film for 33 years. No one knew if they were alive. No one knew if they were dead. No one knew anything at all. In 1897, 3 men vanished into the Arctic in a hydrogen balloon. For 33 years, the world had no answer. Then a walrus hunter found a boot. Salomon August Andrée was Sweden's first trained balloonist, an engineer with a plan that captured his country's imagination. Sweden had fallen behind Norway in the race to claim the North Pole, and Andrée offered a way to leapfrog the competition entirely, fly straight over it. The plan was received with patriotic enthusiasm across Sweden, a nation eager to reclaim polar glory it felt it had missed. At his side were 2 younger men. Nils Strindberg, a scientist and photographer, brought aboard to document the journey. Knut Frænkel, an engineer, brought aboard for his technical skill. The balloon itself was named the Örnen, the Eagle. It had been built in Paris and shipped directly to Svalbard without ever being tested. When measurements on-site showed it was leaking more than expected, Andrée had a decision to make. He chose to fly anyway. In the chaos of departure, Nils Strindberg forgot something small and human, a promised farewell letter to his fiancée, meant to be thrown down as the balloon lifted off. He never got the chance. The plan depended on steering the balloon using heavy drag ropes trailing beneath the basket. There was already substantial evidence the system didn't work reliably. Andrée staked the entire expedition on it regardless. The balloon was leaking before it ever left the ground. Andrée knew it. He flew anyway. On July 11, 1897, the Örnen lifted off from Svalbard with all 3 men aboard. For a short time afterward, the outside world still heard from them. Messages carried back by pigeon, brief updates on their progress. Then even that went silent. Almost immediately, the flight began to unravel. The drag ropes, the entire steering system the mission depended on, became tangled, twisted, and began falling away piece by piece. Andrée and his companions threw sand ballast overboard, trying desperately to hold altitude, as the balloon they knew was leaking continued to lose lift. Within days, some accounts say roughly 50 hours of flight, others closer to 65, verify exact duration against the recovered diary timeline before stating a specific figure. The Örnen came down on the pack ice, hundreds of miles from anywhere. All 3 men survived the landing. But they were now stranded, adrift on shifting sea ice, with no way to call for help, and no one on Earth aware that they were even alive. What followed wasn't a quick rescue. It was a trek. Nearly 3 months, dragging their remaining supplies across drifting, breaking ice, trying to make their way back to any form of civilization. Eventually, they reached solid ground, a remote island called Kvitoya, White Island, northeast of Spitsbergen. They made camp. Within days of finally reaching land, all 3 men were dead. For 33 years, that was where the story simply stopped. No wreckage found. No bodies. No answer. Then, in August of 1930, a group of Norwegian walrus hunters aboard the sealing vessel Brattbag made an accidental landing on Kvitoya. Frozen beneath a mound of snow, they found the skeleton of a small boat, packed with equipment, engraved with the words, Andrée's Polar Expedition, 1896. Verify this engraved date. The expedition launched in 1897. Confirm whether the 1896 reflects when the equipment was purchased or manufactured, versus a transcription error, before stating it as fact. Nearby, the remains of 2 men. A month later, a follow-up expedition found a 3rd body, along with a scattered collection of journals. And then came the detail that turned an accidental discovery into a historic one: photographic negatives, still intact enough to be developed. Notebooks and diaries, still legible in parts, after 33 years frozen in ice. The most striking single object recovered was Andrée's own final diary, found still resting inside the pocket of his coat. When the film was finally developed, it revealed images no living person had ever seen, including a haunting photograph of the crashed balloon itself, taken by Strindberg in the expedition's earliest, most desperate hours. Andrée and Frænkel standing beside the wreck, and Strindberg walking off across the ice to photograph the scene, almost as if documenting a disaster that had already happened to someone else. Paraphrase description: verify exact wording of any published account before quoting on camera. They didn't just find the bodies. They found the last thing each man had written before he died, and 33 years later, someone could finally read it. On October 5, 1930, the remains of the three explorers were carried through the center of Stockholm, described by historians as one of the most solemn, most grandiose displays of national mourning Sweden had ever seen. The film had sat frozen for 33 years. When they finally developed it, the last photograph anyone had ever taken of the Andrée expedition turned out to be a picture of its own wreckage. The myth versus the facts. For 33 years, with no answer at all, the public imagination filled in the blanks. Newspapers speculated about polar bear attacks, about some slow, mysterious curse of the ice that had taken all three men at once. The diaries told a different story, quieter and more human. The men didn't die in a single dramatic event. They died within a short window after finally reaching land, from some combination of causes historians still debate today. The leading theories, each carefully labeled as a theory and nothing more: exhaustion and hypothermia after months of grueling ice travel. Trichinosis, a parasitic illness, possibly from undercooked polar bear meat, a food source they'd relied on during the trek. Carbon monoxide poisoning, from a poorly ventilated stove inside their tent. Or simply the cumulative toll of prolonged cold, malnutrition, and physical collapse. Modern historians have never fully agreed on which of these, alone or combined, actually killed them. And that's worth saying plainly, rather than resolving it artificially. This is one of the rare cases where even the facts side of the story ends in real, acknowledged uncertainty. There was no curse. There was no monster on the ice. There were three exhausted men, a balloon that never should have flown, and a winter that outlasted them by 33 years before anyone found out how. Where the trail ends. Even with the diaries recovered, even with the photographs developed, the exact sequence, the precise cause of death for each man, has never been definitively settled. Trail ends beat. The diaries themselves simply stop. No explanation. No final entry marking the end. The written record just goes silent in the days after they made camp on Kvitoya, and that silence, in the explorer's own hand, is the last thing history actually has to offer. What does remain is preserved today in Swedish archives. The diaries, the photographs, the recovered equipment, the most complete physical record of any failed polar expedition of its era, made possible only because the ice preserved what no rescue ever could. The last entry in Andrée's diary simply stops. No goodbye. 33 years later, that silence was still the only answer anyone would ever get. End.